Hey, good afternoon, everyone. How is everybody today? Thank you all for... Thanks, Jeff, for getting the crowd going. Welcome on a Sunday afternoon to the Museum of Chinese America. My name is Michael Lee. I'm the president here. We don't usually do, programming on Sundays afternoons. Not exactly the time where you try and draw the largest crowd, but we had just a moment in time to do this, and scheduling only allowed for this afternoon. And the reason why there's only a moment in time to do this is because we just have the amazing coincidence where we developed this exhibit that you're sitting in right now, based on Asian American magazines that came out from the 70s to the 2000s. And one of the most seminal magazines during that time was A Magazine, and Jeff Yang was the illustrious founder. At the same time, a huge moment for Asian Americans on Broadway. David Henry Hwang's critics pick, Yellowface, is out right now. Let's give a huge round of applause. And so when Jeff approached us, he said, I've been wanting to come to New York. I've been wanting to do a podcast with David. And I just said, this is the only moment in time we're going to be able to do this podcast in this room while these two shows are going on. And I think that is such an important part of history for us, and the fact that we're so interconnected as Chinese Americans, to be able to kind of work together and talk about it and dialogue about it and just and see each other's success. Because I think when A Magazine came out and Yellowface came out 15 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was 7.
Right? So everything was at much different places back then, and so the time warp now to where we are now with Jeff's son doing television shows, and David, the theater that it's in, Yellowfaces now, is probably twice as large or 3 times as large?
About 3 times as large.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful evolution, but the fact that we're so interconnected and the relationships are all still there, though, it's a beautiful thing for our community. So we're so happy that you guys could be here for this special talk. I don't think it's necessarily about the numbers in this room, but more about the wonderful content and dialogue that we're going to get to witness, and everyone's going to get to witness, thanks to Jeff's podcast called
They Call Us Bruce.
They Call Us Bruce. That's right. So anyway, without further ado, again, a little bit about the museum. The Museum of Chinese American is dedicated to preserving, illuminating, and celebrating the rich history and contributions of Chinese in America here. And so this is obviously part of our history, and we're so thrilled to have it. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, but thank you all for being here.
All right, and thank you guys so much for making time on your Sunday afternoon for this. I know some of you have come from great distances and lesser distances, Boston. And gathering here, in this space especially, brings a little tear to my eyes, not least because this is a place where history is preserved, and I feel all of a sudden like we're kind of a living exhibit of that history. But the opportunity here to speak with a good, longtime friend, somebody who's been both an inspiration, a role model, a leader in so many different ways in our community, in our culture, you never pass up that opportunity, and certainly never pass up that opportunity to do it in front of an audience. So getting the chance to talk to David already is fantastic. We're going to be doing this as a live episode of our podcast, They Call Us Bruce. We do They Call Us Bruce, myself and Phil Yu, Angry Asian Man, approximately weekly. We've got hundreds of episodes. We have a kind of a signature format. The first half of the podcast is just, standard conversational interview. And then the second half is something we call the good, the bad, and the WTF, which is our sort of signature roundtable format conversation where we ask our guest to share with us the good, the positive, the bad, the negative, and finally the WTF, interpret as you will, of a certain thing. So when we get to that, I'll kind of redefine and invite David to share those 3 things. But that break, that will come after the break, and the break will maybe give you guys a chance to stretch a little bit. We really won't take a break. After about 40 minutes or so, after both of those segments, I do want to open it up for live questions from the audience, and that probably won't make it into the podcast, but it's the opportunity for all of us to be part of the conversation with David. And with that, I will kick this off first by introducing our special guest, David Henry Hwang, iconic playwright, and of course the visionary behind so many culture-moving works from FOB, M. Butterfly, Soft Power, and of course, currently on Broadway at the Roundabout Theater. Get your tickets now while you still can. Yellowface, which, again, for those of you who've seen it, it is mind-bending how a work that came from 2007 is so persistently relevant, and maybe even more resonant than ever before today. David, thank you so much. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. As soon as I became aware of you with a magazine, I thought, wow, this is someone who's so smart, so insightful, and really can move the needle.
Oops.
Sorry, all my compliments to Jeff did not heard by anyone. But I said, as soon as as I first heard Jeff, and a magazine came out, I felt this is someone who's so smart, so insightful, such a great cultural critic, and can move the needle. So I am really happy that we're doing this, and I'm talking to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for repeating the agreed upon compliments twice.
I memorized that.
But honestly, you have been such a big part of my adult life in so many ways. I think I shared this with you before, but the first play I ever directed was FOB when I was in college. And from that point on, even when we actually launched A Magazine, which again is part of the exhibit here at the Museum of Chinese America, of magazines from the 90s, you were one of the people who we had reached out to as both kind of an advisor, as somebody who could help us find a way into the conversation. And actually, your family, your father, was really instrumental in actually helping us get started, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of backstory and a lot of interweaving of our lives that probably a lot of people don't know, but which makes, in some ways, not just this conversation, but Yellowface, the play, very kind of intimate and personal to me. I want to begin with that, actually, because this is again, a play that you first put on in 2007. And it is a play that is about a play, and about reactions to that play, and about reactions to that play. It's a work of inception that just is mind-boggling. But it follows from, of course, the Miss Saigon controversy, however you want to frame it, where Jonathan Pryce, white actor, was cast as the biracial Asian lead of Miss Saigon. And that moment was something you were very much at the center of. So I want to wind the clock back to that era and ask that David Henry Hwang of that era, what was he thinking when he first entered into that conversation? What did you think you could do? And then what happened instead?
Yeah, so for those of you who are not so familiar with that history, the musical Miss Saigon, when it first came to Broadway, as Jeff said, Jonathan Pryce was cast as the role of the mixed-race Asian pimp or lead called the engineer. And this led to kind of the first major yellowface protest in New York theater history, and was kind of an early culture wars flashpoint. And I decided to get involved with it in 1990. Part of this is told in the play Yellowface, through a call from B.D. Wong, and wrote a letter. But one of the things that's not in the play is my own history with that sort of protest. To some extent, my career started because of a Yellowface protest. 10 years prior, at the Public Theater here in New York City, a white actor got cast in an Asian role, and this led to yellow-faced protests back when I was still a senior in college, where the Asian actors of that day, who were few in number and had very little power, protested in front of the Public Theater on Lafayette Street. And Joseph Papp, the founder, called them into his office and hired one of them, a guy named David Oyama, onto his staff with a brief to find plays for Asian actors. And it was just about that time that my play, FOB, which I'd written to be done in the lounge of my dormitory in college, came across their desk. So I'm really the beneficiary of an affirmative action program. Because that's what affirmative action is, right? It identifies a social need, and then it creates a program to try to address that. And Joe sort of created his own affirmative action program. But therefore, someone had paid that forward to me, paid it back, paid it forward. I'm not even sure how that would work. But so therefore, when another bigger yellow-faced incident came up, it was really only right that I would get involved with it.
That lends such a context to why you'd actually take this kind of human capital that you'd accrued, this cultural capital you'd accrued from the success of M. Butterfly, right? And then kind of put it on the line and say, hey, I'm gonna try to use this as a lever to move, Cameron McIntosh, the biggest impresario in the world at that time, and try to shame him to some degree to do the right thing. But he didn't, right?
Right, and and arguably I was what was the equivalent of being canceled in those days, canceled by sort of mainstream media and opinion makers, in the sense that just about everybody in the New York and American cultural establishment came out against our position, with the notable exception of Joseph Papp, by the way. Joe supported us. But everybody else, kind of called this an example of political correctness run amok. So looking back, and I think I've only realized this in this current revival, as we were rehearsing it, now in 2024, I realized, I think I was sort of traumatized by the whole thing. And, what it meant to stand up to, not to line in the play, stand up to white supremacy, and how much of a backlash you get, how pissed off people get. And so I started to process that the way that I do most things that upset me through my work. And I wrote a comedy called Face Value, which then became one of the biggest flops in Broadway history, certainly one of the biggest flops in the last 30 or 40 years, closing in previews. So that that was not a salve for my trauma. And then, another 10 years went by, and I thought of a way to reconfigure that basic concept, a comedy of mistaken racial identity, into a different form. Face Value was more a slamming doors farce, and Yellowface is more of a stage mockumentary.
I think what is really brilliant about even just the provenance of Yellowface is the degree to which, much like our Chinese forebears, you will leave no scrap unrecycled into tomorrow's feast. And there is a sense in which every version of the story, as it's been told by you and by others, ends up working its way into the way Yellowface emerges. But this is back in 2007. And I want to kind of put a pin in this, right? I want to make Asian America back in the 2007s again for a moment here. Because this is a moment when it felt like we were kind of on the cusp of breaking through in the culture, where we were about to elect our first Black president, where it felt like diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords anymore, they were a mandate. And the show not only interrogates some of those ideas, because it's not cleanly saying, it's not cleanly an attempt by you to basically rationalize yourself. If anything, one of the most remarkable things about Yellowface, and frankly about a lot of your work, is the degree to which you're willing to hang out dirty laundry and like create sort of self-deprecating versions of yourself. And Yellowface certainly does not make you the hero of this story. So I'm kind of curious, as you were getting ready to put this on stage, what you were thinking. Where did you think this was going to land with people? Did you think people were going to embrace it and say, oh yes, now I understand everything now? Or did you, at the time, feel like it was still maybe going to be pushing limits, perhaps?
Yeah, so for those who might be listening to this and not know the story of Yellowface, I should probably just give a one-sentence summary. It's about an Asian American playwright named DHH who protests the casting of Jonathan Pryce as the Eurasian pimp in Miss Saigon, then accidentally casts a white actor as the Asian lead in his own follow-up to M. Butterfly called Face Value. And when he finds out that the actor is actually 100% white, he tries to cover up his blunder to protect his reputation as an Asian American role model. So, that is not a totally flattering portrayal of the DHH character. In fact, DHH is the butt of most of the jokes in the show, and the person who's making all of the mistakes through most of the show until the end. He has, arguably a moment of redemption. And yes, Jeff, when I think about 2007, it felt like all these issues around what we then most usually referred to as multiculturalism had been pretty much resolved. And we may recall that a little later, when Obama did get elected, there was this whole talk about being a post-racial society, that we've solved racism, for about a month. And so it was actually a more hopeful time for those of us who take a progressive point of view. And so, if anything, I think I wanted to interrogate what I thought were pretty accepted and sort of mainstream positions now on diversity and multiculturalism, to start to have a conversation about, okay, what's the next step? And what about this needs to be rethought or continue to evolve?
It's kind of remarkable because those accepted tenets you're talking about, these ideas of course you'd cast Asians as Asians, of course you'd want to have authenticity, at least in the casting and the portrayal in key roles, because it's better for the story and it's politically, if we want to say, correct. And hey, it's also morally something that addresses the absence and erasure, and even worse, the yellowface replacement of Asians throughout culture for centuries, right? At the same time, a lot of, I think, what is going on in Yellowface picks up on a theme in your work, which is nothing is ever that simple. You're not actually saying, no, you're not pointing to something saying, this is the answer. We have actually gotten to a place where we can assume this to be true. There's constantly a pendulum swinging back and forth between two extremes, and where you end up is kind of this ambiguous middle, which is challenging for audiences. I mean, I think a lot of us watching Yellowface and other works of yours do feel uncomfortable at the end because we want a closure that you don't necessarily provide, right? But at the same time, Yellowface in particular, it comes into a conversation where today especially, right, and we're going to move now to the version of it that's on Broadway today, we aren't necessarily as concerned, perhaps, about the same things that back in 2007, you were interrogating. That there's a sense in which Asian leads, the whole attempt to find a hot Asian guy who can act, right? That's no longer a bridge too far. And so the decision to actually bring this back, right? What were some of the conversations you had to have to say, is this still going to work for these audiences?
So this Broadway revival basically came out of something that started at the beginning of the pandemic, which was Lee Silverman, who is my longtime collaborator and director, who directed the original Yellowface, and we've done like 7 or 8 shows together. Lee, at the beginning of the pandemic, was like, oh God, we're never gonna do theater again. Isn't it sad that nobody's gonna get to see Yellowface? And why don't we try to do an audio version of Yellowface? So Daniel Day Kim, Daniel's company 3AD, had just started a partnership with Audible. And so that's how Daniel came into the picture as a co-producer. And then it took like 3 years to make all these deals. And so by the time we finally got around to doing it, the bulk of the pandemic was over. And we pulled together, the Audible version exists, and it's pretty great. It's a different iteration, of course. But it's Daniel as DHH, and Ashley Park, and Benedict Wong as my father, Wendell Pierce as the reporter, Jason Biggs as Marcus. And we got as many people as we could together around the table and read it out loud, and it felt funnier than it did in 2007. And so I think there are ways in which the play speaks to today for good reasons and also bad reasons. So the good reasons are we start to feel like, oh, the culture has moved closer to the play because these issues of identity, of appropriation, casting, representation, were slightly more niche issues, or I think at least a mainstream audience or a white audience, wasn't. In 2007, they were a little nervous about laughing, and in 2024, they felt, oh, very much in the center of American popular discourse. So that's a good reason. The bad reason is that in 2007, as you say, it's like a pretty good time to be an Asian American, like China was still really fun. And in 2023, 24, it's also a scary time to be Asian. Just like the play portrays a lot of China panic incidents from the late 1990s, including the prosecution of the Chinese American scientist Wen-Ho Lee. And we are at a moment now where everybody's, once again in this country, really panicked about China. And Chinese American scientists are once again being investigated. So that added to the spike in anti-Asian hate that happened during the pandemic, and the fact that the China virus guy is now going to be in the White House again, suggests that the play is timely, but for reasons that we would rather not have it be.
Well, they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And for somebody who works with lyrics, rhyming can end up with a limerick, or it can end up with great epic poetry. And in this particular case, to your point about this being relevant again for good and bad reasons, and of course the recycling of even political history that we're seeing, for me, there is absolutely a sense in which when you put anything on that was of a certain moment, right, there's a nostalgia factor. Mm-hmm. You're sort of transporting yourself back to then. But there are also layers and nuances that come from the transposition of time. And one of them, frankly, is, let's just say, like, the fact that you have Daniel Day Kim as the lead in this, to me feels like the most poetic of poetic justices. This is somebody who, in many ways, has been the most visible person in our popular culture as Asian Americans, and certainly the person who is kind of like our personal hero, but who has never really kind of gotten the shine that he's deserved. He hasn't been number one, if you will, on the call sheet in his TV and film productions, and he's never had the opportunity to play a lead other than the King in King and I, right? Which
On Broadway, right.
on Broadway,
Yeah.
which in a way is a role that has almost been reserved for whoever the most, present day iconic Asian American figure who can kind of sing and dance to play. And for him to play DHH in this, it just seemed like a squaring of the circle, like a closure. A closure you don't give in other ways, but certainly on stage, seeing him there was remarkable. And of course, he was the one, like you said, who brought this forward as an audiobook. The first question I want to ask about that is, in working with Daniel, right, how did you talk about what you wanted him to bring to his portrayal of, well, you?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's incredibly flattering to be played by Daniel Day Kim.
You're basically twins. I mean,
Yeah, right. I was thinking, oh, this must be how like Aaron Brockovich felt, to be played by Julia Roberts or something. One of the ways in which Daniel, in particular, intersects with this role relates to what you were just talking about. That DHH in the play is an activist who, as I said, is trying to protect his reputation as an activist. And Daniel is someone who actually is an activist. And then, so to watch him kind of scramble to and lie and do all these things to try to protect himself and make himself look good, there's a matchup between the character he's playing and his own real life persona, which is, I think, adds to the comedy and is quite delicious. And also people don't know that Daniel Day Kim can be funny. So that's a big revelation. But we talked about, mostly, like I definitely didn't want him to do the hair and the, the weird hair and the beard, because, why would you want to make Daniel Day Kim look like anyone other than Daniel Day Kim? But it's really about trying to capture the sense of somebody who their activism and their reputation is important to them. And then what happens when that person makes a mistake. And I like the fact that in 2024, this show is also saying it's okay to make a mistake. We all make mistakes. You have to take accountability at some point, but you can move on from that because we're trying to do some things that haven't been done before. And of course, there are going to be some things that go wrong.
I just want to know how America could make the same mistake it made in 2016 in 2024. That's what I want to know.
Well, there's that, yeah.
But to the point of Daniel and what it means for him to play this role, again, as DHH, the central question of the play is essentially, how do we find a hot Asian male who can be charismatic on stage and convincing to a theater audience? And, of course, he's the one actually using all this. And, like, the answer's right there, dude. It's like, he is the guy who is asking this question, right?
Right, I think it's also, and you're sort of saying this as well, it's also about, wow, in 2024, in a season on Broadway, which has multiple celebrities, from, Robert Downey Jr., to Denzel Washington, and you need a star to be in a play on Broadway this season, that there is an Asian American star, there's actually more than one now, who could play that role both artistically and commercially, who will be able to sell tickets. So that's a really important breakthrough in and of itself. But yes, there's a moment when Daniel's playing DHH and he's standing on stage saying, all we have to do is find a straight, masculine, Asian leading man. And the meta of it is that, yes.
Where could we find that, right? And, that also speaks to the culture and how this changed. In addition to racial and ethnic shenanigans, one of the things your work has frequently commented on is gender roles and expectations around them, and the stereotypes that are attached to them, especially when those things intersect. Asian men, Asian women, what do people expect differently across that gender and race divide. And we are now in an era where hot Asian men are kind of everywhere, it feels like. I mean, post crazy occasions, if you don't have a six-pack, what are you even doing, I want to speak to that real quickly before pivoting to talking about some of your other works, because the thing to me that I see as the real breakthrough, right, for our culture, as much as I loved Crazy Rich Asians, as much as I loved Shang-Chi, as much as I loved all the works that featured Asian men who flex and ripple, is actually the fact that Jimmy O. Yang, who's funny as hell, has like a latter-day new chapter as a romantic hero and action star, right?
Yep.
He's somebody who, when I look in the mirror, I'm like, that's Jimmy O. Yang. That's not that's not Daniel Day Kim, right? And I wanted to ask you about that because even in not just Yellowface, but also and Butterfly and FOB, that whole question of what it takes to be an Asian man and perceived as masculine is a core question.
Yeah.
So what's new now?
Well, you bring up Jimmy O. Yang, and I have to say that I did a conversation a couple nights ago with Charles Yu and Chloe Bennett about the new Hulu series Interior Chinatown, in which Jimmy O. Yang is the lead. And yeah, Jimmy O. Yang does not have a six-pack, and he still can be the romantic lead now, which, by the way, has been the case for white actors for a really long time. So that is a significant cultural change, because not only do you, in terms of what it means to be an attractive Asian man, you don't have to be perfect looking. You can still be just a regular looking guy and be a romantic lead, and that's a huge shift in the culture. And Interior Chinatown's great, by the way.
I cannot wait to see all of it. I have screeners. And honestly, if we keep on talking about pivot points in the culture, that is one which I expect will actually unleash a whole new wave of conversation around these things.
One thing I want to add about Broadway in that regard is that, when we think about Broadway shows with Asians, chances are you're thinking about a show that's set in Asia. Whether it's Miss Saigon or South Pacific or King and I or whatever. Up until the aughts, there was only one show in Broadway history that was ever about Asian Americans, and that was Flower Drum Song, both in the original Roger and Hammerstein iteration and in my version. Now there have been some other shows on Broadway that feature Asian American stories, but for Yellowface to be on Broadway, one reason that, I started my career in 1980, so I thought, only my shows that are set in Asia are ever going to get to Broadway. So it's incredibly satisfying for an Asian American story of mine to be on Broadway.
Again, this is what is different now. And again, some things are the same. And I do want to actually now talk a little bit about soft power, right? As we discuss, again, the rhyming of history, here we are again. You wrote soft power, in the wake of Hillary Clinton, running for office. And at that time, we all thought, hey, this is an opportunity. We're going to actually see a woman president, right? And that turned out not to be the case. And here we are in 2024. Once again, woman president, Asian president, black president, not so much. I want to ask you, because soft power did have a revival in DC, what you had to do to make that play work in the wake of so many of the things we've seen since then? Because you had to rewrite parts of it, right? You had to rethink it.
Yeah, so Soft Power is a musical that I wrote with the composer Janine Tesori. We did it at the Public Theater right before the pandemic in 2018. And it's essentially about a reverse King and I. where a Chinese national comes to the US and falls into a relationship, a romantic relationship with Hillary Clinton just after she loses the 2016 election. So, you know, and it did fine. You know, it was a finalist for the Pulitzer that year, and we were a Grammy nominated that year. But the whole question about getting to Broadway, first of all, there was the pandemic, and then it was, you know, Biden was president, and Janine and I continue to feel, you know, there's stuff that we want to fix. It's just too unwieldy, this musical. So we did this new version at Signature Theater, which is just outside DC, over the summer, and we're very happy with this version. And I thought, you know, in the best of all possible worlds, Harris becomes president, and maybe the show doesn't need to come back to New York. So I will say what I said to Lee Silverman after the 2016 election, which was, well, I think this will be bad for the country, but it could be good for our show. So we'll see.
Silver linings. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have not seen it, it is really quite brilliant, and much like your other works, very meta. It's from the perspective, in many ways, it's a musical within a play, right? And I haven't seen the latest version, but in the version I saw, it was kind of framed by this commentary, because the production was something being put on by China as a way to help understand America and all our craziness, right? And I don't know if those are still...
Yeah, we've simplified that a little, because we started to feel like, wow, and it also involves the fact that I was stabbed in the neck a number of years back. So that's in the musical, so it's meta in that regard. But one of the big differences between the public theater production and the one we just did over the summer is a wonderful white actress played Hillary in 2018, and we decided to go with an all-Asian cast at Signature. And now this fantastic Asian American actress named Grace Yu played Hillary in DC, and was, you know, fantastic, and just recently sang a number from the show at one of the theater benefits. But that felt right too.
That is remarkable, because it is something you also play with in Yellowface,
Yeah.
Kind of cross-casting, forcing people to interrogate what it means to actually have somebody with a certain face on stage playing a certain role. But to actually go that step of casting an Asian person in the role that is singularly supposed to be white, it's you know, ironic, but beautiful.
Yeah, and it is one of those things where as soon as Grace Yu came on stage as Hillary, after 2 minutes, it was completely cool. Like, you totally felt like you were watching Hillary Clinton.
So the last thing I want to ask before we go to break, and then maybe come back and do our signature segment, is about the emerging cycle of plays, the DHH cycle, if you will, where it does feel like you are tracking beats in your life on stage, you know, doing that kind of trauma bonding with the audience, kind of on-stage therapy. But that's 2 plays now where we've seen DHH as a character, both Yellowface and now Soft Power as well. Do you see this as something that is going to continue? Is there a DHH trilogy that's going to happen?
Yeah, I kind of hope not. You know, the DHH in Yellowface was, I was you know, nervous about, okay, if I name the character for myself, is that self-indulgent, which is actually a line in the play. And then with Soft Power, it's just like my stabbing started getting into it, and so it just kind of made sense to call the character DHH. Hopefully I do not have another major trauma like that, such that I would then write myself into another piece.
You know, so we can, as audience members, we can both hope and also fear that might be the case. Well, we're going to take a quick break now, and when we come back, we're going to do our signature segment, our favorite segment, the good, the bad, and the WTF. So stick around.